Sometime in the early 1890s, Bram Stoker sat in the Whitby Public Library reading through a book about Wallachia. He was the business manager of the London's Lyceum Theatre, but on this summer holiday in Yorkshire, he was deep into research for a novel about a vampire. Since the very beginning of his work, he'd been calling his villain Count Vampire, about as subtle as naming a detective Inspector Clues. But on a fateful day in the William Wilkinson's An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia from 1820, Stoker found a footnote that gave his work its final shape. Dracula in the Wallachian language means devil. His notes, preserved in the Rosenbach Museum, hint at this eureka moment. As Count Vampire was simply crossed out, Count Dracula was written above it. In that instant, a round-of-the-mill vampire got baptized with a name that would outlive empires. And today, we will take a look at all the aspects that shaped Dracula's image and meaning, from history to linguistic corner cases, with fantasy literature, superstitions, and fears of the time in between. Throughout this video, I will refer to the original Dracula story created by Stoker. Initially, I was planning to give an abridged version in one chapter, but then the script got rather big and I didn't know how long this video would be. Oh my god. So, I decided to give you a proper retelling of the whole story in the next video. So, going forward in this video you can expect brief introductions of key characters and events, but that's about it. If you find this video interesting, you'll enjoy the next one as well. And if you're one of those people who hate spoilers of any kind, go watch another video first. I put it somewhere here once it's done. With this out of the way, let's dig in. Wilkinson's footnote was only telling half the story, and possibly the wrong half. The name Stoker had just discovered actually meant two completely different things at once. And that double meaning might be the whole reason we're still talking about it today. The exact same word refers to both the Christian devil and the mythical fire-breathing creature. The Romanian language inherited this from Latin, where Draco meant dragon or serpent, and over centuries of religious influence, that serpent became synonymous with Satan himself. Stoker, sitting in that library, probably didn't even know about the dragon's meaning. He saw devil and recognized the perfect name for his monster, foreign enough to be exotic, meaningful enough to carry dread, simple enough to remember with a nice ring to it. The historical figure behind that name, Vlad, who ruled Wallachia in the 15th century, wasn't actually called the devil by his contemporaries, at least not officially. His father, Vlad II, had been induced into something called the Order of the Dragon in 1431, a chivalric society founded by the Holy Roman Emperor to defend Christianity against the Ottoman Empire. Members wore a badge showing a dragon with its tail coiled around its neck. Because of this membership, Vlad II became known as Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon. When his son came to power, he inherited the name with a patronymic twist. In Romanian, adding an A creates what we'd call son of in English. So Vlad became Dracula, son of the dragon. Not the devil's son, which technically could imply Antichrist, but dragon's son. A badge of honor from a Christian military order. Twist like a Toyota MR2 released in France. Except, and this is where we go deeper into this wordception, to a regular Romanian speaker who didn't know about obscure chivalric orders, the name would have carried that devilish undertone anyway. Imagine if someone today called themselves John Lucifer Jr. They might have a perfectly legitimate reason. Maybe Lucifer is an old family name meaning lightbringer in Latin, but good luck explaining that at every family party. So, when Stoker chose Dracula from that footnote, he was unknowingly selecting a name that had lived a double life for centuries. Think about how perfect this accidental choice was for what Stoker was creating. His vampire count needed to be both aristocratic and demonic, both powerful and damned, both ancient nobility and incarnate evil. The name Dracula contained all these contradictions, probably without Stoker even realizing it. Think about how many millions of people know the name Dracula today. How many movies, books, TV shows, video games, Halloween costumes and breakfast cereals have used it. We're talking about a pop culture empire worth billions. And the strangest part? Most people who know Dracula, the character, the movies, the whole vampire thing, have no idea about any of this. They know at the most that there was someone called the Impaler who gave birth to the story. In fact, that was me. I didn't even know about Stoker's story. I thought the Vlad II was just, well, thirsty, and that was the beginning of the whole movement. When in fact, after familiarizing myself with his life, I was genuinely surprised. Don't get me wrong, there is a reason why he went down the Alley of the Ages as the Tepesh, the Impaler, but he didn't do so just because he wanted to reinvent Christmas decorations. Picture trying to build a house on property line where your two neighbors absolutely hate each other's gardens. Every time they fight, which is constantly, they trample through your garden to get to the others' one. And both of them keep trying to convince you to let them store their house in your garage. That's basically what it was like to be Wallachia in the 15th century. This country sat right between the Kingdom of Hungary to the north and the Ottoman Empire to the south. To be more precise, the principality stretched from the Carpathian Mountains down to the Danube River, roughly where southern Romania is today. Good farmland, decent trade routes, but nothing spectacular. What made Wallachia special, or cursed depending on how we look at it, was its cultural location. The Hungarians saw it as their buffer against the Ottoman expansion. The Ottomans saw it as their gateway into Central Europe. And the Wallachians? They just wanted to survive another decade without being absorbed by either empire. Now we get to the first puzzle piece that built Dracula. Wallachia had developed this peculiar political system that seemed almost designed to create chaos. At the top was the voivode. That's essentially the prince or ruler. But unlike in Western Europe, where the eldest son usually inherited the throne, Wallachia had no law of primogeniture. Any male descendant of the previous ruler could theoretically claim the throne. Your older brother, your younger brother, your cousin, your nephew, that guy who claims he slept with your mom. They all had equal legal standing. You can see the problem immediately, right? Instead of one clear heir, you might have a dozen potential claimants circling every time a voivode showed weakness, or died, or just looked tired on the Tuesday. But wait, it gets worse. The voivode wasn't actually all-powerful. He had to deal with the boyars. These were the noble families who owned most of the land and controlled local military forces. Think of them as somewhere between medieval lords and a corporate board of directors. They formed what was called a sfatul domestic, the princely council, and the voivode needed their support to actually govern. Here's the thing about the boyars though, they weren't particularly loyal to any ruler. Why would they be? With no clear succession law, backing the wrong prince could mean losing everything. So they developed survival strategy. Keep the voivode weak enough that he needs you, but not so weak that the country falls apart. If a ruler got too powerful, maybe it was time to support his cousin's claim to the throne. If he got too cozy with the Hungarians, perhaps the Ottomans would appreciate knowing about that nice alternative candidate you've been keeping in reserve. Many maintain relationships with multiple potential rulers simultaneously. They'd send gifts to exiled princes, maintain correspondence with Hungarian nobles, maybe slip some information to the Ottoman officials. It wasn't treachery in their minds, it was just insurance. The system created a vicious cycle. Because rulers knew they could be replaced at any moment, they had to spend enormous energy just staying in power. But the things they needed to do to stay in power, crushing rivals, building loyalty, maintaining military forces, made you unpopular, which made you vulnerable, which made the boyars start looking for alternatives. In addition to this, all those big neighbors we mentioned loved this system. It was perfect for them. Hungary and the Ottoman Empire both maintained stables of potential Wallachian rulers in exile. Whenever they wanted to pressure Wallachia, they just unleashed one of those claimants, backed by a small army and a promise of support. Even if the invasion failed, it kept the current voivode distracted and desperate. The Ottomans were particularly clever about this. They demand tribute, basically protection money, but they'd make it just painful enough that the voivode would be unpopular for paying it. Then they'd offer to support a rival who promised to pay even more tribute. The Hungarians played similar game, offering military aid that came with strings attached, then withdrawing support at crucial moments to remind everyone who was really in charge. For context, between 1418 and 1456, that's just 38 years, Wallachia had at least 11 rulers, some of whom reigned multiple times. One guy, Dan II, managed to gain and lose the throne 4 separate times. Imagine being crowned, overthrown, fighting your way back, getting overthrown again, coming back again, overthrown again, and still thinking, man, 4 times the charm. I mean, nobody said they lacked motivation. Note that these numbers are still open to deliberation, as historical records of medieval Wallachia are not what we call comprehensive. This political instability affected everything. Trade suffered because merchants never knew whether the next regime would honor their agreements. Military defenses were weak because soldiers didn't know who they'd be fighting for next month. Infrastructure projects, why would a fortress be built when your rival might be living in it by next winter? The boyars actually preferred this chaos to some degree. A weak, constantly threatened voivode needed them. He'd grant them land privileges, tax exemptions, anything to keep them on his side for just one more season. But once again, this created a paradox. The more the boyars gained from weak rulers, the weaker the principality became overall, making it more vulnerable to external pressure, and everyone's position became more precarious. Some voivodes tried to break the cycle by bringing in foreign mercenaries or creating new boyar families loyal only to them. But this just made the old boyars more paranoid and more likely to conspire with rival claimants. Others tried to play the great powers against each other, taking Hungarian money while promising the Ottomans neutrality. But this required a level of diplomatic finesse that was hard to maintain when you were also trying to prevent your own nobles from stabbing you in the back, sometimes literally. The few rulers who survived more than a couple of years did so through a combination of ruthless pragmatism and careful balance. They paid off the Ottomans just enough to avoid invasion, but not so much that they looked weak. They gave the boyars enough power to keep them happy, but not enough to threaten the throne. They maintained just enough military force to deter rivals without appearing tyrannical. This system shaped young Vlad III in ways that would echo through history. Because when you grow up watching this system, when you see ruler after ruler try to play nice and end up dead or exiled, when you understand that the traditional rules guarantee chaos rather than preventing it, well, maybe you start thinking the whole system needs to be burned down and rebuilt. Enter a young man who spent his childhood as a hostage in the Ottoman court, watching and learning. A young man is about to discover that sometimes the only way to stop being pawn is to flip the entire board. In 1431, a baby was born into what might have been the worst family business in Europe, trying to rule Wallachia. This was Vlad III, though nobody would call him that for a while yet. His birth year matters because it coincided almost exactly with his father receiving that dragon badge we talked about in chapter 1. So, from the beginning, this kid was the son of the dragon, Dracula, whether he liked it or not. Let me paint you a picture of the household Vlad grew up in. His father, Vlad's second Dracul, was scrabbling for power like everyone else in Wallachia's broken system. The family tree was a mess of competing branches. The Draculesti line, in which Vlad belonged, was locked into a multi-generational deathmatch with a Danesti branch. These were cousins who would literally murder each other's children to eliminate future rivals. So, average medieval casual Friday. Vlad had at least 3 brothers we know about. There was Marcia, the eldest, being groomed for succession. There was Radu, later nicknamed Selfrumos, the handsome one, who was younger than Vlad. And another brother, Vlad the monk, who apparently decided early on that he wanted to be a killer. A killer when it comes to spitting Bible lines, that is, as the monastery was safer than from room. Smart guy. Vlad's childhood wasn't exactly stable. His father gained and lost power multiple times, forcing the family into exile, then back to power, then into hiding again. Imagine being 6 years old and having to flee your home because daddy's political enemies are coming to kill everyone, then moving back, then fleeing again. The lesson here wasn't subtle. Power is temporary, trust no one, and always have an escape route planned. Real education began in 1442 when Vlad was about 11 years old. His father had made a deal with the Ottoman Sultan Murad II. Military support in exchange for tribute and, oh yes, 2 of his sons as hostages. This wasn't unusual. It was actually a widespread practice among medieval elites, a sort of human collateral system. You want peace? Leave your kids with me. You want alliance? Send me your son. The idea was that rulers would think twice about breaking agreements if their children's lives were on the line. So young Vlad and his little brother Radu were packed off to the Ottoman court. Their father had literally traded them for political stability. Boys, you're going to live with an enemy for a while. Don't worry, as long as I don't betray them, they probably won't kill you. This is the risk I'm willing to take. You may imagine Vlad chained in some dungeon, treated horribly, developing his later cruelty through abuse. But that's not how the Ottoman hostage system worked. These weren't just prisoners, as I explained in chapter 2. There were diplomatic investments. The Ottomans wanted these boys to grow up understanding Ottoman culture, maybe even sympathetic to it. The plan was to eventually send them back as rulers who would be, if not allies, at least informed partners who understood Ottoman power. We know that Turks did something called devshirme. It was sort of Ottoman blood tax, where they forcibly recruited soldiers and bureaucrats from among the children of their Balkan subjects. Knowing that, we can assume that Vlad could have received an excellent education. Among the topics he could have learned were Turkish, probably Arabic and Persian, studying the Quran alongside Ottoman history and law. He could also train in combat with Turkish weapons and tactics. He had a chance to observe one of the most sophisticated bureaucrats in the world, watching how the Sultan managed an empire that was stretched across 3 continents. This wasn't torture, it was more of an elite education that most European princes would never receive. But, and this is quite huge but, he was also constantly reminded that he was an outsider, a hostage, a bargaining chip. While Ottoman noble children were being groomed for governorships and military commands, Vlad knew his future depended entirely on his father's loyalty and Wallachia's subservience. He was privileged and powerless at the same time. Every day, Vlad saw how the Ottomans operated, their administrative efficiency, their military discipline, their use of calculated brutality to maintain order. The Ottoman Empire didn't suffer from the Wallachia's succession chaos because it had systems, sometimes harsh ones, that prevented it. When succession disputes did arise, they were settled quickly and definitively, often with all political rivals being strangled with a silk cord. Clean, efficient, and final. Meanwhile, his younger brother Radu was thriving. Radu was charming, adaptable, and genuinely liked by his Ottoman hosts. Some sources suggest he became a favorite of the Sultan's son, the future Mehmed II. While Vlad remained psychologically resistant, an outsider looking in, Radu was becoming culturally Ottoman in many ways. This would create rift between the brothers that would last their entire lives. Think about what life that was. You're smart enough to understand that you're being programmed, but you can help absorbing the lessons anyway. You see your little brother accepting what you resist. You realize everyone is playing angles, and the only difference between victory and death is who plays them better. House of Cards, basically. Then, in 1447, Vlad learned the ultimate lesson in Wallachian politics. His father and older brother Marcia were murdered by the Wallachian boyars allied with the Hungarian regent John Hunyadi. As the tale tells, the boyars buried Marcia alive, while his father was killed in the marshes of Balteni. And like that, the boys in the Ottoman custody got upgraded to claimants to the Bloody Throne. Very British. Bloody Throne? The Ottomans saw an opportunity. They released Vlad, now about 17, and gave him a small force to claim his inheritance. Not out of kindness, they wanted a ruler in Wallachia who owned them everything. But think about Vlad's position. It was quite peculiar. His father was dead for trusting the wrong people. His older brother was murdered for being an heir. His younger brother has almost completely sided with the Ottomans. And here he was, backed by his captors, trying to rule a country where the nobles had just murdered his family. The first reign in 1448 lasted only a few months before he was driven out. But the first lessons were taken. So there's 17-year-old Vlad in autumn 1448, riding into Wallachia with a small Ottoman force, ready to claim his murdered father's throne. 2 months later, he's running for his life. The timing of Vlad's first attempt was actually quite convenient. Mentioned earlier, John Hunyadi, the Hungarian regent who'd orchestrated his father's murder, had just suffered a crushing defeat at the Second Battle of Kosovo against the Ottomans. His army was scattered and his attention elsewhere. The current Wallachian ruler, Władysław II, from the rival dynasty branch of family, had marched with Hunyadi and was presumably weakened. The Ottoman backing gave Vlad just enough military muscle to seize the Targowiще, Wallachia's capital. For maybe 60 days, Vlad III became voivode of Wallachia. We know almost nothing about what he actually did during this time. No surviving decrees, no chronicles describing his brief policies. It's like he'd been there just long enough to sit on the throne, look around, maybe pick the wall paint for the bedroom, and realize he had no idea how to actually hold it. Because here's the thing about seizing power versus keeping it. They require completely different skills. Vlad had the Ottoman army to get him through the door, but once inside he needed the boyars to actually govern. And the boyars looked at this teenage son of the murdered Vlad Dracul, backed by the Turks, who everyone knew were the real threat to Wallachian independence, and collectively said nope. Władysław II returned from Kosovo, gathered boyar support, and Vlad's Ottoman backers mysteriously melted away. Maybe they decided Vlad wasn't worth all the military commitment. Maybe they got better offer from Władysław. Whatever the reason, Vlad found himself suddenly very alone in a court full of people who'd helped murder his father. He returned to the Ottoman lands and then fled further to Moldavia, Wallachia's neighbor to the north, then to Hungary. Yes, the court of the very man who'd ordered his father's assassination. This seems insane until you understand the logic of medieval Romanian politics. Hunyadi didn't personally care about Vlad. He cared about having options. Today, Władysław II was his man in Wallachia. Tomorrow, who knows? Maybe that young Vlad might be useful. Keep him around, keep him hungry, keep him as a threat to wave at Władysław if he gets too independent. Between 1448 and 1456, Vlad became a professional claimant, one of those exiled princes haunting foreign courts, always planning their return, always just one sponsor away from another attempt. Pretty much like startup. He shows up in the records here and there. In Transylvania, he met with Hungarian nobles. In Moldavia, visiting his cousin, the ruler Stephen, even possibly backed in Ottoman territory at some point. During these 8 years, Wallachia went through its usual chaos. Władysław II held on, but barely. There were at least 2 other serious claimants circulating. There was Dan III, another dynasty prince who had his own supporters among the boyars. There was also Basrab II, son of the Dan II. Each of these men had their own boyar factions, their own foreign backers, their own vision of how to fix Wallachia's problems. The country itself was bleeding from this constant uncertainty as usual. Trade agreements would be negotiated by one faction, then cancelled when their rivals gained influence. Ottoman tribute would be promised, then withheld, then desperately offered again when Turkish armies approached. Hungarian protection would be sought, then rejected, then sought again. The boyars played every side, switching alliances based on who looks stronger this week. Every negotiation was a battle, every alliance was temporary, every supporter was a potential traitor. Meanwhile, Vlad was watching all of this from exile. He saw Władysław II trying to balance the interest of the boyars and slowly losing control. He observed how other claimants made their moves. Too early, too late, with too much trust in their backers. He noticed which boyar families always seemed to survive regime changes and which foreign promises actually materialized into support. And by 1456, something had shifted in the regional power balance. Hunyadi had died of plague after a successful defense of Belgrade against the Ottomans. Władysław II had begun making overtures to the Turks, breaking his alliance with Hungary. And suddenly, Vlad, once again, wasn't just a spare claimant anymore. He was Hungary's best option for replacing the unreliable ally. This time, Vlad came with Hungarian backing and hard-won experience, and set the tone from the get-go. The chronicle says he met the Władysław II in single combat near Tarksor and killed him himself. Whether that's true or propaganda, it sends a message about what kind of ruler Vlad intended to be. 8 years of watching Wallachia tear itself apart had taught Vlad a simple lesson. In a land where everyone's playing by dirty rules, the dirtiest player might be the only one who survives. And here we get to the meat. When Vlad took power in 1456, he didn't announce a new age of justice or prosperity. He announced new rules for trade tariffs. A bit anticlimactic, but it shows that he understood that controlling money meant controlling power. And anyone who challenged that control would discover what kind of ruler they were dealing with. Let me pause here and talk about sources, because this is where things get tricky. Most of what we know about Vlad's actual reign comes from 3 types of documents: German pamphlets written by his enemies, Russian tales collected decades later, and a handful of official letters and decrees. The Germans had every reason to exaggerate his cruelty. He'd attacked their merchant communities. The Russian stories were essentially folklore by the time anyone wrote them down. And the official documents tell us what he wanted to project, not necessarily what happened. So when a German pamphlet claims he impaled 20,000 people in one afternoon, we should be skeptical. When a Russian tale says he nailed turbans to the ambassadors' heads, we should wonder if that's a metaphor or history. But when multiple independent sources describe the same basic patterns, brutal punishments, attempts at centralization, conflicts with merchants, we can start to see the outline of real policies underneath the propaganda. Here's what we can say with a reasonable confidence. Vlad steadily moved to break the power structures that had made Wallachia ungovernable. Repeat. As I said before, he started by issuing new commercial regulations requiring all foreign merchants to sell their goods at designated market towns. Over time, there was no more direct travel to noble estates, no more private deals that avoided taxes. Everything had to go through the official channels, where his officials could monitor and tax it. The Saxon merchants from Transylvania hated this. For generations, they'd maintained special trade privileges in Wallachia. The right to travel freely, to trade directly with anyone. to essentially operate as a parallel economy that enriched both them and their boyar partners. And these weren't small traders. The Saxon merchant guilds from Brasov and Sibiu were major economic powers. When they protested his new regulations, he didn't care and added more restrictions. When they tried to go around his rules, he confiscated their goods. When they appealed the protectors in Hungary, he made things worse. This wasn't random tyranny, it was economic warfare designed to break the financial networks that had traditionally limited princely power. The escalation was swift and brutal. The Saxons started supporting rival claimants to Vlad's throne, particularly Dan III. Among others, they also sheltered Wallachian boyars who fled Vlad's court. They spread propaganda about his cruelty. Though, honestly, they didn't need to exaggerate much. In response, Vlad launched raids into Transylvania, targeting Saxon communities with a ferocity that shocked even medieval observers used to military brutality. The attack on Brasov in 1459 became legendary. His forces didn't just loot the merchant quarter, they destroyed it systematically. The surrounding villages were burned, and then came the impalements. Not the massive numbers that pamphlets claim, but enough to make the point. The bodies were arranged where every traveling merchant would see them. The message was clear. Those are the stakes of defying me. Now a word about impalement itself. We need to understand this wasn't just random sadism. It was a carefully chosen method of execution that served multiple purposes. First, it was public and prolonged. Unlike hanging or beheading, which were over quickly, impalement could last hours to even days. The victim was displayed throughout, a living or dying advertisement for the prince's power. Second, it had a symbolic meaning. In medieval Christian thought, how you died determined your afterlife, at least to a point. A bit simplified take, but it will suffice. Impalement was considered particularly shameful, denying the victim a good death. It was typically reserved for the worst criminals, traitors, heretics, enemies of the state. By using it liberally, Vlad was essentially declaring entire categories of people as enemies, deserving the worst possible fate. Third, and this is crucial, it was theatrical in a way that transcends language barriers. You didn't need to speak Romanian to understand a forest of impaled bodies. Ottoman envoys, Hungarian spies, German merchants, they all got the same visceral message, regardless of their native language. But here what can get lost among the horror stories? Vlad didn't rule just for shits and giggles. He was simultaneously trying to build a functional state. From sources, we can infer that he issued laws standardizing weights and measurements and normalizing prices of essential goods. He created what appears to be one of Wallachia's first systematic border controls. He tried to establish a reliable census for taxation purposes. His relationship with the boyars during this period was, well, complex. If you've been paying attention so far, nothing in medieval Wallachia history is straightforward. He didn't massacre them wholesale, instead he took a note from dwarfs and opened his book of grudges. Boyars from families that had opposed his father were gradually removed, sometimes killed, sometimes exiled, sometimes just economically destroyed. Meanwhile, he raised new men to the noble status, creating a boyar class that owned him everything. There's a famous story about him inviting all the boyars to the Easter feast, then having them arrested and marched to the Ponerai to build his castle. Like most Vlad stories, it's probably exaggerated, but archaeological evidence suggests Ponerai castle was built or rebuilt during his reign, using forced labor. The symbolism is just perfect here. The old nobility literally building the foundation of the new order. His administrative reforms extended to the military. He created his own standing army, small but loyal directly to him rather than to regional boyars. He standardized military services obligations. He established fixed fortifications along key routes. By 1460, something remarkable had happened. Wallachia was actually going in a stable direction. Trade was flowing through official channels, taxes were being collected. The succession crisis that had plunged the principality for decades seemed to be over. Of course, this stability was built on a fear rather than consent. The boyars weren't loyal, they were terrified. But effects were visible even to foreign observers. Hungarians were displeased that Vlad successfully eliminated a number of their potential alternative candidates. Even the hostile German sources gave the impression that crime disappeared, at least to some degree, from Wallachian roads. The story about leaving a golden cup at public fountain that no one dared steal might be propaganda, but it captured something real about the atmosphere of total control Vlad had achieved. All this came at a cost though. By alienating the Saxons, Vlad had cut off a crucial source of revenue. By terrifying the boyars, he'd eliminated the traditional intermediaries between the prince and the people. By maintaining a standing army and extensive fortifications, he'd created expenses that required even higher taxes. The state he was building was strong but brittle, held together entirely by fear of its creator. What was also inevitable was that his success has attracted attention. The Ottomans had tolerated a weak, chaotic Wallachia that paid irregular tribute. A strong, centralized Wallachia under a prince who seemed to be building a military capability, that's a no-no. By 1461, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, was beginning to ask questions about exactly what Vlad was planning with all this newfound order. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether Vlad's brutal new order could survive contact with the greatest military power of the age. He'd spent 6 years proving that fear could create stability, and now he went to war with it. By spring 1462, the math was simple. Mehmed II was marching toward Wallachia with somewhere between 60 and 150,000 troops. Sources disagree here, but even the lowest estimates meant Vlad was outnumbered at least 3-1. The Sultan, who had ended the Byzantine Empire and was rapidly becoming the nightmare of European rulers everywhere, had decided that Vlad needed to be replaced permanently. The trigger had been Vlad's refusal to pay tribute and his increasingly aggressive raids across the Danube. But the real issue was that Wallachia under Vlad had become unpredictable. Mehmed's plan was straightforward: march into Wallachia with overwhelming force, install Vlad's brother Radu as the new voivode, remember him, that charming one who was close to Ottoman culture, and turn Wallachia into a proper vassal state rather than this increasingly problematic buffer zone. The Sultan had done this before in Serbia, in Bosnia and Albania. He had every reason to accept it would work again. But Vlad had spent his years as a hostage studying Ottoman tactics. He knew he couldn't win a conventional battle. The Ottoman army included the famous Janissaries, elite infantry that had broken almost every European army they faced. They had superior artillery, better logistics, and most importantly, numbers that Wallachia simply couldn't match. A stand-up fight would last maybe an hour before Vlad's forces were annihilated. So, Vlad chose not to fight conventionally at all. As the Ottoman army crossed the Danube in early June, they found a wasteland. Vlad had ordered a complete evacuation of the population from the Ottoman path, burning crops, poisoning wells, and destroying anything that could feed or shelter the invading army. The Ottoman chronicle Trusunbeg, who was actually there, describes the mounting frustration of the Turkish forces. They were winning every skirmish but conquered nothing. Vlad's forces would attack supply lines, then disappear. They would strike at night, targeting specific units, then vanished into forests the Ottomans didn't know. The mighty Ottoman army was being bled by an enemy that refused to stand and fight. Then came the night of June 17th, which history would remember as the night attack. Despite dozens of different takes depending on sources, here's what we can reasonably reconstruct. Vlad gathered his forces probably around 7,000 to 10,000 men for a gamble. He would personally lead a night assault directly into Ottoman's camp, aiming to kill Mehmed himself. If successful, the Ottoman invasion would collapse into succession disputes. If it failed, well, at least it would be a memorable death. The attack began a few hours after midnight. They penetrated deep into the Turkish camp, causing chaos and confusion in the darkness. Ottoman sources admit the attack caused significant casualties and came dangerously close to the Sultan's tent. Mentioned Tursun Beg writes about the terror of that night. Soldiers striking as shadows, unable to tell friend from foe, the sound of the battle coming from every direction. The psychological impact was enormous. The greatest army in the world had been made to feel vulnerable in its own camp. The Sultan himself had been threatened. But, and this is crucial, the attack ultimately failed in its main objective, as Mehmed survived. Different sources gave different reasons. Some say Vlad's forces attacked the wrong tent, killing the Grand Vizier's guards instead of the Sultan's. Others say the Janissaries railed and drove off attackers before they could reach Mehmed. What happened next depends entirely on which source you believe. Romanian and Hungarian accounts portray it as strategic victory. Vlad withdrew in a good order, having shown the Ottomans that conquering Wallachia would be costlier than they imagined. Turkish sources acknowledge the shock, but emphasize that they continued advancing afterwards, suggesting the attack didn't stop them. And then we get to the most famous, most disputed moment of the campaign: the Forest of Impaled. According to multiple sources, though they differ widely on details, as the Ottoman army approached Targovište, they encountered a massive display of impaled bodies. Turkish prisoners from previous raids were arranged in neat rows along the road. The Greek historian, and this is a wonderful name, Chalk-Crocodiles, writing a few decades later, claims there were 20,000 bodies. The Ottoman chronicler, I won't even attempt to read this chronicler, mentions the site but gives no numbers. A Serbian janissary named Konstantin Mihajlović, who claims to have been there, describes the Sultan being impressed by Vlad's ruthlessness, which, I mean, you see, my friend, this is some impressive statistics. Good KD ratio. Thinking about it now, 20,000 is a bit of a high number. The logistics alone make it questionable. That's more people than lived in most Wallachian cities. The wood required, the labor needed, the time it would take, it seems physically impossible. More likely there were hundreds of bodies, maybe 1,000 or two, which would still be a shocking sight, but you know how it is in stories. Number big, number impressive. Despite that, what matters isn't the exact count, but the psychological warfare at play. Vlad was speaking in impalement, and everyone got it. I mean, the message, not impalement. Did it work? Here's where sources diverge completely. Romanian tradition says Mehmed, faced with the forest of the impaled and exhausted by guerrilla warfare, decided Wallachia wasn't worth it and withdrew. Some Turkish sources suggested the Sultan said something like, "I cannot take the land from a man who does such things," and then retreated out of respect or disgust or something. But Ottoman administrative records, they show Radu being installed as a voivode by late summer 1462. They show Wallachian boyars accepting Ottoman suzerainty. In other words, the invasion succeeded in its political objectives, even if it didn't result in a total conquest. What actually happened seems a bit more complex than either side's propaganda admits. The night attack and, the forest did convince Mehmed that directly annexing Wallachia would be too costly, but it didn't save Vlad's throne. The boyars, exhausted by 6 years of terror and faced with Ottoman army that, despite the night attack, was still very much intact, started defecting to Radu. By autumn 1462, Vlad was fleeing toward Transylvania with a small band of loyalists, while Radu took power with Ottoman backing. The night attack and the Forest of Impaled had become a legend. But that's about it. So, Vlad fled to Transylvania in late 1462, probably expecting sanctuary from his supposed ally, the new Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus. Instead, he got arrested. The man who'd spent 6 years as the terror of Wallachia suddenly found himself in chains. And the best part is that nobody is really quite sure why. The official reason, according to Corvinus, was that Vlad had been secretly negotiating with the Ottomans. There were letters, allegedly from Vlad to Mehmed, offering to switch sides if the Sultan would support him against Hungary. Vlad's supporters claimed these were forgeries, and honestly, they probably were. The letters just happened to surface right when Corvinus needed an excuse not to help Vlad against the Turkish invasion, despite having received Pope Pius II's crusade funds for exactly this purpose. I presume those were not refundable. Forging a few letters seemed like a easier option. To be more precise, the Pope sent him 40,000 gold florins to fight the Ottomans. He'd pocketed the money and done nothing while Mehmed steamrolled Vlad. Now he needed someone to blame for this embarrassing failure to launch a crusade. What a better scapegoat than the conveniently defeated Wallachian prince who couldn't effectively protest. But there's another layer here, a quite obvious one. Corvinus didn't execute Vlad, which would have been the normal response to treason, sending love letters to Ottomans. Instead, he kept him as a sort of high-status prisoner, first at Buda, then Visegrad, possibly even at other loyal residences. It wasn't a dungeon situation. Vlad was under house arrest in some of the finest buildings in Hungary. Why keep him alive and relatively comfortable? Because, again, even as a prisoner, Vlad was useful. He was a legitimate claimant to the Wallachian throne, a card Corvinus could play whenever Radu or the Ottomans got too comfortable. He was also, weirdly, becoming something of a celebrity. The German pamphlets about Vlad's cruelties were circulating widely by now, and people were fascinated. Here was this actual monster, the impaler of thousands, just sitting in a Hungarian castle. Diplomats would visit Corvinus and ask to see the famous Dracula. It was like having a captured dragon. Dangerous, legendary, and absolutely great for your reputation, as long as you kept it chained. So, this proves the true crime isn't something new. Stories start appearing about Vlad's behavior in captivity that seem designed to rehabilitate his image. For example, there was a story of him punishing thieves among the servants, showing he still cared about justice. Maybe he impaled a couple of thousand people, but he's such a nice guy. Around 1466, the rehabilitation campaign intensified. Rumors spread that Vlad had converted to Catholicism, abandoning the Orthodox faith of its homeland. This would have been huge, a major propaganda victory for Catholic Hungary, against both the Orthodox Russians and the Muslim Ottomans. Whether Vlad actually converted or just played along for political advantage is impossible to know, but the timing is suspicious, coming just as Corvinus was starting to reconsider Vlad's usefulness. By 1467, Vlad wasn't exactly free, but he wasn't exactly a prisoner either. He was living in a house in Pest, across the river from Buda. He'd somehow gotten married to a relative of Corvinus, possibly the king's cousin. Think about that transition, from imprisoned war criminal to royal in-law in 5 years. Either Vlad was incredibly charming when he needed to be, or Corvinus was playing a very long game. The marriage aspect is particularly fascinating because it came with a property and status, but not freedom. Vlad was now a Hungarian nobleman, technically part of royal family, but still not allowed to leave. He was being domesticated, transformed from a wild impaler into respectable member of the Hungarian court, ex-impaler. He even had children, at least 2 sons we know of. So those would be Dracula. Sounds about right. Meanwhile, back in Wallachia, Rad was struggling. That's a flash news. The boyars who'd abandoned Vlad for him discovered that Radu was essentially an Ottoman administrator. He was competent but uninspiring, more interested in maintaining stability for his Turkish masters than in Wallachian independence. By 1473, Radu was dead, and Wallachia was once again in chaos. And this was the Corvinus moment. The Ottomans were distracted by wars in Angolia. A new crusade was being discussed, and here was Vlad, conveniently converted to Catholicism, married to the Hungarian royal family, and still, technically, the legitimate voivode of Wallachia. Time to play card he'd been holding for 14 years. But first, Vlad needed to prove he could still fight. In 1475, Corvinus allowed him to join campaigns in Bosnia. Officially as the Hungarian noble rather than as a Wallachian prince, just to stretch his legs. The real test came in summer 1476. Stephen the Great of Moldavia, Vlad's cousin, had been fighting the Ottomans and needed Wallachian support. The current Wallachian ruler was proving unreliable. Corvinus Stephen and Vlad formed an alliance. Vlad would return to the throne with a Hungarian and Moldovan backing and, in return, resume the fight against the Ottomans. In November 1476, Vlad entered Wallachia for the last time. The initial campaign went well. Basra Blajota fled. The boyars submitted, and by late November, Vlad was issuing documents, again as a voivode. One surviving letter from this period, dated November 7th, shows him confirming land grants and trying to restore normal administration. After 14 years, he was officially back, but not for long. We don't know exactly how he died. The most common story is that he was killed in a battle near Bucharest in December 1476, either fighting the Ottomans or Basra Blajota's forces. One account says he was assassinated by his own men. Another claims he disguised himself as a Turkish soldier for reconnaissance and was killed by his own troops. The exact date, location and circumstances are all disputed. So is his burial. Tradition says he was buried in Snagov Monastery, on an island in a lake north of Bucharest. But when archaeologists excavated this supposed grave in 1931, they found it empty. Expect some animal bones. Ooh, vampires. Another grave nearby contained a headless corpse in rich clothing, but the dating and identification proved impossible. Here's what strikes me about this final 14 years. Vlad went from terror of Wallachia to prisoner to Hungarian nobleman to brief ruler to dead in about this time it takes a kid to grow up. He adapted to each role. The captive who impressed his captors, the convert who married into royalty, the aging prince making one last grab for power. But none of these roles quite fit the man who'd created Forest of the Impaled. The years in prison and the Hungarian exile had humanized him, but maybe not in a way propaganda at the time wanted. We see him playing political games, managing his reputation, building a family and working within systems rather than destroying them. The man who'd ruled through fear was learning to survive through adaptation. The Catholic conversion, real or fake, showed he could be flexible when needed. The Hungarian marriage showed he could play the long game. But when he finally got his chance to return, it lasted maybe 6 weeks. The man who once held off Mehmed II couldn't hold on to power in the changed Wallachia of 1476. Maybe he was too old, too tired, too compromised by his years of Hungarian captivity, or he just got unlucky. The Vlad who died in 1476 had been many things. The Vlad of 1462 could never have imagined being. But was he still Dracula, in that most mainstream sense? Or had that person disappeared somewhere between Targovište and Buda, leaving only an aging prince trying to reclaim a throne? In my opinion, he was never there. I think he was just calculated and ruthless, trying an approach he deemed had the best chance of success based on years of observation. There was no terror for terror's sake, or beheading someone on a whim. Sure, most likely he was a sociopath, but that's about it. Given that, let's step back from the blood and drama for a moment and take a look at a question that political theorists have been wrestling with for centuries. Can one actually build a functioning state through terror? Not just seize power, not just hold it temporarily, but create lasting institutions that outlive the strong men who created them. Niccolò Machiavelli tackled this exact question about 50 years after Vlad's death, though he probably wasn't thinking about Wallachian princes when he wrote. You probably heard someone asked whether it is better to be feared or loved. Sentiment usually aligns with the idea that fear wins, but that's not what he actually argued. Machiavelli said that ideally you want both fear and love, but since that's nearly impossible, fear is more reliable because love depends on the people's mood, while fear depends on your actions. An important fact that it's left unspoken is that he specifically warned against being hated. Fear without hatred can maintain order. Fear mixed with hatred causes shit to hit the fan. So, how does Vlad fall on this spectrum? The Forest of the Impaled isn't exactly winning hearts and minds. I know, brave theory, but I reckon it was a bit much even for your average public execution enthusiast. Keep in mind that every medieval state used violence to maintain order. The difference was that most rulers dressed it up in ritual, law, and divine right. Some may even believed it. Vlad stripped away the pretense to the point. You don't pay taxes because God ordained it, or because it's traditional. You pay because the alternative involves a sharp stick in your ass. My RS is taking notes, probably. To give it a little more specific spin, when it comes to creating a regime, I saw many breakdowns of factors at play, but one I found most universal is this. There are three factors. Coercion, can you force compliance? Consent, do people accept your rule as legitimate? And capacity, can you actually govern? Successful states used all three, but with just two, they can somehow limp along, sometimes for a long time. Kim Il-sung in North Korea was de facto leader from 1948 to 1994, about 46 years. In this framework, Vlad maxed out coercion. The ability to force compliance made him famous. His capacity was surprisingly strong too. He did collect taxes, standardize laws, and maintain an army. You may guess what was missing here. The boyars complied but never accepted. The merchants paid but plotted. The people obeyed but didn't support. When external pressure came in 1462, the fact that most people wanted him gone was self-evident. Compare this to other medieval rulers who used terror. Take Louis XI of France, ruling at almost exactly the same time as Vlad. He was called the Universal Spider for his web of surveillance and control. Like other monarchs, he used torture, imprisonment and execution, but he embedded his terror within traditional structures and was able to manipulate them to his own ends and get rid of his opponents without restoring to mass executions. Well, at least not without a proper casus belli. I know it's not strictly about military action, but remember, battles are won by soldiers, but wars are won by politicians. Or consider Ivan the Terrible. A century later in Russia, he created the Oprichnina, basically a dictatorship carved out of part of his territories, keeping the illusion of a normal functioning state. He then gave birth to new state police, gave them monk-like robes, a dog head for sniffing out treason and a brooms to sweep it away as symbols, and said, "Get to work." He killed thousands, yet portrayed his violence as defending true Russia against traitors. And all that when Lenin wasn't even on the horizon. He managed to sideline boyars to a degree and preserve orthodox legitimacy, thereby achieving his goals. His terror was ideological, not just practical. He wasn't killing enemies, he was purifying the realm. There's another distinction worth making. Signal versus substance in terror politics. Sometimes rulers use spectacular violence more to signal their capacity for violence than to meet actual necessity. A few visible executions can prevent thousands of crimes. Not because guards are everywhere, but because people believe they might be. This is efficient terror, maximum deterrence from minimum violence. I bet there were fewer shoplifters when you get your hand chopped off for it. One thing I find particularly interesting, without modern communications, surveillance or bureaucracy, how do you actually control a territory? Medieval rulers typically relied on intermediaries, nobles, clergy, guilds, to translate royal will into local action. But Vlad learned that intermediaries were potential traitors. Given this, the stakes could have been his attempt to govern directly, using fear as a substitute to the administrative capacity he didn't have. Building on that, I gave you the idea of path dependence, how previous choices constrain future options. Once Vlad chose terror as his primary tool, he couldn't easily switch to persuasion or negotiation. Who would trust the Impaler's promises? Who would believe in his mercy? I mean, he literally dealt with his opponents Red Wedding style. The terror that initially gave him power meant he had to constantly double down on it. Trying to put a cap on this stream of consciousness, given Wallachia's specific circumstances, were there actually better alternatives? And by saying that, I don't mean that Mr. Dracula did nothing wrong. I just want to play devil's advocate. If you get this joke, congrats, you've been listening. Previous rulers who'd tried to build consensus had been overthrown. I'm curious if the scale of Vlad's punishments was intentional from the very beginning, or is he leaning into it, seeing initial success, and, dare I say it, felt that thirst of blood. This is the problem with terror as a governing strategy. It's hard to build anything that lasts. Vlad created order, but it was entirely personal. When he fled in 1462, his entire system vanished overnight. No institution survived him. No governing philosophy emerged from his experiments. His reign left behind only stories and nightmares. As far as I can tell, there were no similar regimes in a region that Vlad could take note of and adjusted his strategy. Closest, I think, were the Ottomans, but again, executions there were generally accepted as a part of law. Over the years, we could see totalitarian terror that lasted for a very long time, as the USSR or China, but those use it to create space for something else: law, ideology, prosperity, identity. They made people want to belong to their states, not just fear leaving them. Or should I say, act like they tried to do so. Vlad never made that transition, and yet he has gone viral. That was a smooth transition. Not through social media, obviously, but through the cutting-edge technology of his era, the printing press. Within 20 years of his death, his story was being mass-produced, translated, and spread across Europe faster than any medieval ruler's reputation before him. The Impaler became a bestseller before bestsellers existed. The German pamphlets started appearing in the 1480s, barely a decade after Vlad's death. They were more like medieval tabloids, cheap printed sheets with sensational stories and crude woodcut illustrations. The earliest ones we know about were printed in Nuremberg, Augsburg and Strasbourg, major centers of the new printing industry. They had titles like The Frightening and Previously Unknown Story of the Wild Bloodthirsty Man, Dracula the Voivode. Why did German printers care about an obscure Romanian prince? Remember those Saxon merchants Vlad had attacked? They returned to their cities with stories of unprecedented cruelty. But more importantly, they returned with a grudge and access to this new technology that could spread their vision of events to thousands of readers. The printing press had been invented around 1450, right when Vlad was beginning his political career. By the time he died, it had evolved from novelty to weapon. These pamphlets weren't trying to be balanced historical accounts. They were propaganda, pure and simple. But they were also entertainment. Medieval readers loved sensational stories of exotic cruelty, and Vlad delivered. In spades. So, as we can see, the media really didn't change that much. One pamphlet describes him nailing hats to the heads of ambassadors. Another tells of him dining surrounded by impaled victims. A third claims he forced mothers to eat their own children. The stories got more elaborate with each printing. The genius of these pamphlets was their specificity. They introduced numbers. 20,000 impaled here, 30,000 killed there. They're named places: Brasso, Sibiu, Targowiście. They dated events. This precision made them feel true even when they were wildly exaggerated or completely invented. Specific lies are more believable than vague ones. At roughly the same time, completely different stories about Vlad were circulating in Russia. These weren't printed. Russia wouldn't get printing press for another century. Instead, they were manuscript tales, copied by hand and passed between monasteries and noble courts. The Tale of Dracula the Voivode exists in several versions, all slightly different, as it was basically a phone game. There's a famous Russian story, hinted before, about Vlad placing a golden cup at the public fountain. Despite the country being full of thieves, no one dares steal it, because they knew the punishment would be worse than anything they could imagine. When I read about it for the first time, I immediately get this Papa Stalin vibe. Another Russian tale has a foreign merchant complaining that his gold was stolen. Vlad catches the thief and returns the gold, but adds one extra coin to test the merchant's honesty. When the merchant reports the extra coin, Vlad praises him. If he had kept it, he would have been impaled alongside the thief. The moral isn't Vlad is evil, but Vlad rewards honesty and punishes deception. The translation process itself changed the stories. When the tales moved between countries, words shifted in meaning. Actions got reconstructed. Medieval translators often improved text, adding details they thought readers would appreciate. A simple execution became an elaborate impalement. A harsh punishment became a sadistic torture. There's also the question of which Vlad these stories actually describe. The pamphlets often conflate Vlad II Dracul with his son Vlad III Dracula, attributing the father's action to the son's or vice versa. Some stories seem to be about entirely different Wallachian princes, just with Dracula's name attached because it sold better. The historical person was already disappearing in a composite monster back then. One more angle when it comes to looking at these pamphlets are the woodcuts. These are crude but effective. They show Vlad dining among forest of stakes, each topped with a writhing victim. He's usually depicted with a mustache and a cap that would become iconic, but the proportion of fact versus fantasy in those? The pamphlets also established narrative patterns that would persist for centuries. The dining among the dead scene, the forest of the impaled, the cruel but clever prince, the violence that maintains perfect order. Fiction was crystallizing into a formula you are probably recognizing today. By around 1500, the legend of Vlad III was being printed in German-language short-form editions. One source I found notes more than 14 editions by then. The story was thus widely circulated and took a life on its own. Meanwhile, the Italian humanist Antonio Bonfini, writing for the Hungarian court in the 1490s, included Vlad in his Historia Pannonica, describing both his cruelty and his role as a sovereign. But the sensational printings about the Vlad horrors outpaced the academic narrative, and it's the former that took hold in history. A lie told often enough becomes the truth. The Russian tales eventually made their way back to Romania, where they influenced local oral traditions about Vlad. The German pamphlets spread through the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. By 1600, versions of Dracula stories existed in German, Russian, Romanian, Hungarian, and Turkish. Each culture had shaped the story to its needs, but the core, spectacular violence, absolute power, memorable cruelty, remained constant. 400 years before Bram Stoker sat down to write, the narrative machinery was already in place. The geography of Transylvania and Wallachia was already exotic and threatening. Stoker wouldn't have to invent his villain from scratch. This part concludes our part of why Dracula is a person. Now let's dig into why Dracula is a word. A symbol is never just one thing. Take the dragon, simultaneously divine protector and satanic destroyer, ancient wisdom and primal chaos, the guardian and monster. The fact that one word could mean such opposite things might seem like a misstep, but when you think about it, symbols are powerful precisely because of their ability to hold many meanings. And the Order of the Dragon, which gave Vlad II his nickname and Vlad III his patronymic, understood this perfectly. When Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund founded the order in 1408, he was tapping into centuries of layered meaning that would resonate differently with different audiences. For educated Christian nobles, the dragon explicitly represented the one slain by St. George. Members were warriors of Christ, fighting against the dragon, which symbolized both the Ottoman Empire and heresy. But the dragons meant something completely different in other contexts that the order couldn't control. In heraldry, dragons often represented vigilance, courage and protection. The world dragon, for example, the Chinese imperial dragon. These weren't enemies but embodiments of strength. The Christian tradition had spent 1,000 years trying to make the dragon purely evil. Fun trivia fact I learned while recording this is that medieval bestiaries described dragons as the enemy of elephants and vice versa. I can't really put my finger on why, but elephants symbolized Christ. Apparently, they symbolized loyalty, chastity, and protective guardianship. And since dragons equals devil, then we get this image of animal-on-animal violence. St. George, St. Jared, St. Michael, all the dragon-slaying saints reinforce this message. The Satan serpent, not that they were elephants. This symbolic clusterfuck becomes even more pronounced when you factor in the linguistic dimension. In Romanian, as I mentioned earlier, drag means both devil and dragon. But it's the tip of the iceberg. The words around drag take on all sorts of meanings. Dracos means devilish or mischievous. Drashi means both devilry and cleverness. Affide Drac means to be cunning. Dus Draculi means gone to hell, but Dragdeon can mean a clever fellow. It's like English uses wicked to mean both evil and impressively good. The ambiguity is baked into daily speech. When people called young Vlad Dracula son of the dragon, they were locating him in this entire symbolic field. Not just his father's son, but heir to all those contradictory meanings. There's a phenomena in semiotics called semantic cessation. When you repeat a word enough, it loses meaning. Not to get tangled into politics, but you probably heard the word fascist used even for the description of mashed potatoes at this point. Funny thing is, with symbols, the opposite happens. The more they're used, the more meanings they accumulate. The dragon of the order became dragon voivode, became the devil's son, became the impaler, became the vampire. Each iteration added rather than replaced the meaning. The accumulation process explains why some symbols became what might be called mythically sticky. Give me a heads up in comments if this phenomena has a name. They attract stories, explanations and interpretations. Dracula was one of those words, and when one Victorian footnote was written spelling Dracula means devil, it was just scratching the surface. In this sense, Vlad's name probably played a larger part in creating this story than he did. So, 4 centuries later, when Stoker found and grabbed onto his name, he wasn't just borrowing a spooky word, he was tapping into an entire symbolic ecosystem. Dragons, devils, orders, rebellions, east, west, good, evil, all spinning around a name that refused to mean just one thing, a writer's goldmine. But if you have been paying attention, nowhere so far had the word vampire been given or indicated in any way. By the 1890s, London was the most modern city in the world. Electric lights, underground trains, telegraph wires. and its educated class were absolutely obsessed with vampires. The more rational and scientific Victorian society became, the more it craved ancient horrors. The vampire had already been stalking English literature for 70 years before Stoker sat down to write. Dracula's grandparents were born in 1819, the famous year without the summer, when Lord Byron, Percy Shelley and their companions told ghost stories by Lake Geneva. Mary Shelley created a Frankenstein from this gathering, but Byron's personal physician, John Polidori, wrote something equally influential, The Vampire, featuring the aristocratic bloodsucker Lord Ruthven. Polidori's vampire wasn't a rotting peasant from folklore. He was a nobleman, charming, moving through high society, seducing victims with sophistication rather than force. This was new. The vampire as aristocrat, as social infiltrator. Polidori had taken a piece of Balkan folklore and dressed it in evening clothes, making it suitable for London rooms. The concept exploded through Victorian popular culture. James Malcolm Rymer's Varney the Vampire ran for 220 chapters as a penny dreadful between 1845 and 1847. Varney was melodramatic, occasionally sympathetic and prone to long speeches about his cursed existence. He introduced the idea of the vampire as a tragic figure, not just a monster. He also pioneered the commercial serialization of horror. Readers paid week after week to follow his adventures, making him perhaps the first multimedia vampire franchise. Then came Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla in 1872, and suddenly the vampire was female, an infinitely more disturbing vision to Victorian sensibilities. Carmilla didn't just drink blood. She formed intimate friendships with her female victims first. Smut in a world where the view of an uncle gave you a heart attack. Outrageous. But all these literally vampires were missing something. Authenticity. They felt made up, arbitrary, gothic decoration without gothic foundation. What the Victorian vampire needed was roots. Genuine folklore, the weight of actual tradition. Enter Emily Gerard. Gerard was exactly the kind of person the British Empire produced by thousands. A military wife followed her husband's posting to distant corners of the world, observing local customs with the confident superiority of imperial civilization. Her husband was stationed in Transylvania in the 1880s. And she did what educated Victorian women did. She took notes on the quaint local superstitions. Her essay, Transylvania Superstitions, appeared in the 19th Century magazine in July 1885. Most of it is standard Victorian ethnography, patronizing, treating Romanian beliefs as curiosities. But, buried in her catalogue of folk practices, she dropped this line, more decisively: evil is the Nosferatu, or vampire, in which every Romanian peasant believes as firmly as he does in a heaven or hell. That word, Nosferatu, was gold. It sounded ancient, authentic, genuinely foreign in a way that vampire no longer did. Gerard claimed it was the Romanian word for the undead, though modern linguistics have struggled to find it in actual Romanian sources. It might be a corruption of necuratu, unclean, or nesuferitu, insufferable one. Or Gerard might have misheard something entirely. Doesn't matter. It sounded real. And in folklore, if it sounds real, it's being real. Gerard's essay provided exactly what Victorian vampire fiction had been missing, the sense that these creatures came from somewhere specific, that actual people actually believed in them. She described how Romanians protected themselves with garlic and crosses. As far as I can tell, all those stereotypical vampiric traits came from her observations, since they weren't present in popular culture before, not a wide Western one at least. She gave the vampire a cultural context that made it feel discovered rather than invented. This was the media ecosystem waiting for a story that could synthesize all these elements: ancient folklore and modern fears. On one hand, Jack the Ripper was rampant and fears were real. The pieces were all there. Polidor's aristocratic vampire, Varney's commercial success, Carmilla's intimate horror, and Gerard's authentic folklore. On the other hand, the intellectual and media infrastructure was ready too. The folklore had been collected, processed, and packaged for consumption. The typewriters were clicking, the presses were rolling, all the ingredients for a modern myth were present in that Victorian Crucible, waiting for someone to speak the right name and bring the creature to life. That name, as we already know, would be Dracula. But the man who chose it was still just a theater manager in London, reading travel books and folklore collections, about to decide what to do with his life. Bram Stoker spent 7 years preparing to write Dracula. That's longer than most PhD dissertations. And to give the credit where it's due, his research was probably better than many of those dissertations. The Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia now holds his working notes. Over 100 pages of handwritten research, character sketches, plot outlines, and source lists. As mentioned, Stoker was a theater manager at the Lyceum, working for the legendary actor Henry Irving, who nobody remembers anymore. His day job involved logistics, publicity, managing tours, essentially a modern-day agent. But in his spare time, he was constructing his own elaborate fantasy, approaching it with the methodical planning of someone accustomed to creating complex productions. Every detail needed documentation. His reading lists, carefully preserved in those notes, is staggering. He worked through dozens of books, travel accounts, histories, folklore collections, maps, and train schedules. He read mentioned William Wilkinson's An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia from 1820. He studied Major E.C. Johnson's On the Track of the Crescent. He consulted Sabine Baring-Gould's Book of Werewolves and the Germany Past and Present. Each book left traces in his notes. He copied passages, sketched maps, lists of foreign wars. Funny thing is, for the first years of planning, his vampire villain wasn't named Dracula. The early notes from around 1890 consistently referred to Count Vampire, and the novel itself was initially titled The Undead. Stoker had already plotted most of the story, already developed the main characters, already structured the narrative. Count Vampire from Styria, not even Transylvania yet, was going to be his bloodsucker. And then, sometime during his research, Stoker encountered what was mentioned at the very beginning, Wilkinson's book with its faithful note, and just like vampires are supposed to, Dracula mesmerized him. His notes show him copying out the key passage. Dracula in the Wallachian language means devil. The Wallachians gave this name to any person who distinguished himself either by courage, cruel actions, or cunning. Refer to previous chapter. The change was instantaneous. One page has Count Vampire, the next has that crossed out and Count Dracula written above it. He didn't just change the name, he changed the geography from Styria to Transylvania and added historical depth to the character and began weaving in details about Wallachian history and the fight against the Turks. Quite ironic given how his work is looked at nowadays, Stoker didn't really know much about Vlad III. The connection between the vampire and the medieval ruler was made in 1958 by Cecil Kirtley in book Vlad the Impaler. Next was Radu Florescu and Raymond T. McNally, who published In Search of Dracula in 1972. This is when this story took off. On the one hand, there is still debate in the scientific community about whether this claim can be factual. On the other hand, no one cares. So, while Stoker did his homework and sourced folklore and history, all the details we are trying to connect with the Impaler are probably coincidence. Or are they? Given the breadth of Stoker's research, I'm sure he'll be able to dig some more into specifically our Tepesh. And don't get me wrong, he probably had a few generic statements about him. My take on this is that he left this part vague on purpose. Specificity kills universality. If Dracula were clearly, explicitly Vlad III, then he'd be just one historical figure with one particular story. But if Dracula is sort of an ancient nobility, sort of timeless evil, then he can be anything. Any reader's anxiety. This principle of strategic vagueness appears throughout Stoker's research method. He collected massive amounts of specific detail, but deployed it selectively. His notes on Transylvanian geography are extensive. He copied out train schedules, calculated travel times, and marked distances between cities. But in the novel, Jonathan Harker's journey became increasingly dreamlike and unmappable as he approaches the castle, the Dracula castle. The precision dissolves into a nightmare exactly when it matters the most. The Whitby section shows Stoker's research method at its peak. In July 1890, Stoker spent 3 weeks in Yorkshire fishing town with his family. But this wasn't just a vacation, it was location scouting. His Whitby notebooks show him working like a detective. He walked the town systematically, noting angles of view, relations between locations, and counting the famous 199 steps to the abbey. He sat in the churchyard copying inscriptions from gravestones, real names that would appear in his novel. He sketched the harbor's layout and talked to locals. That's how he learned about the Russian schooner that had wrecked near Whitby 5 years earlier, named Demeter. Stoker copied down the details, but in his notes, he's already transforming it. The real wreck becomes the fictional Demeter, carrying Dracula to England. At this point, I had to say, I really admire the amount of work Stoker put into creating Dracula. Honestly, I thought that he had heard some version of the story where Vlad is a cannibal and went from there. But the number of damn I went through reading about him speaks for itself. He had gathered all different types of information: vampire characteristics, geography, ship arrivals, medical, legal. He was building a world systematically, making sure each element connected logically to the others. The novel's format itself, told through diary entries, letters, and newspaper clippings, mirrors his own research method of collecting and collating resources. His medical research deserves a special mention too. Stoker consulted his brother William, a doctor, about blood transfusions and brain diseases. The notes include questions about how much blood a person could lose and symptoms of anemia. He wanted the vampirism to feel medically plausible, even while being supernatural, which is my favorite kind of fantasy. Despite that, he also used poetical license where he could. Emily Gerard's essay on Transylvanian superstitions, which gave him the word Nosferatu, also described the vampires quite differently from the count. According to her, local folklore portrayed vampires as peasants, often bloated and ruddy. Nothing like the aristocratic pale Dracula. Stoker took what served his purposes and discarded the rest. Note that apparently Emily's notes were not overly precise, but I let it be. He also largely ignored contemporary vampire fiction. Despite Polidori, Varney, and Carmilla establishing certain vampire conventions, Stoker felt free to reinvent rules. His vampire could walk in the daylight, though weakened, transform into various animals, and control the weather. Those weren't traditional folklore powers. They were Stoker's innovations, presented as ancient knowledge. He wanted to create something that felt authentic without being constrained by authenticity viewed by others. His 7 years of research gave him the authority to speak about places he'd never been. His notebooks reveal one more trivia. Stoker never visited Transylvania. His Transylvania is entirely constructed from books, maps, and imagination. Who knows, maybe that's how he managed to give his story an edge. So a curious thing happens when you try to follow Jonathan Harker's route to Castle Dracula using Stoker's directions. You can get amazingly far, right up until the moment you actually need to find the castle. The geography is precise until it matters, then it dissolves into a dream. Look at what Stoker wrote in his notes. Borgo Pass and coordinates. and those are real. You can plug them into Google Maps, maybe not 3/4 part right now, and find yourself the Tihuta Pass between Transylvania and Moldavia. He continues tracking realistic routes through his notes. Munich to Vienna, Vienna to Budapest, Budapest to Klausenburg, Klausenburg to Bistritz. Each of these stages is real, verifiable and followable. The schedule is real, but then something shifts. Harker describes traveling through the pass and then continuing for hours in darkness, losing all sense of direction or distance. The precise Victorian traveler with his journal and the train schedule suddenly can't tell where he actually is. This geographical shift from precision to vagueness creates an aura of mystique. The real documentable journey makes us trust Harker as reliable narrator. We're following through real places on real trains, so when he tells us he's lost somewhere beyond Borgo Pass, we believe in his lostness. The real geography gives credibility to monsters beyond. This technique appears throughout the novel. Whitby is referred with utmost observable accuracy. The Abbey ruins, the view from the churchyard. As we saw in chapter 12, Stoker had walked these roads himself. But Carfax, Dracula's English estate, exists in a carefully crafted geographical limbo. It's near enough to London to be convenient, but far enough to be isolated. It has neighbors, but no neighborhood. You could search every estate sale notice from 1890s England and never find it. Yet it feels completely plausible. The effect it brings to mind, at least for me, is those medieval maps where known coastlines are drawn as accurately as possible, but the outer edges fade into "here be dragons" territory. When Victorian readers saw Transylvania, they didn't picture actual Romanian territory. They pictured the edge of the known world, where the Ottoman Empire had met Christian Europe. Here the West became the East. Modern tourist industries have tried to reverse engineer Stoker's geography, putting Castle Dracula definitively at Bran Castle or creating Dracula's Castle Hotel at the actual Borgo Pass. But this is a bit funny in my eyes. The power of Stoker's geography is its refusal to be pinned down. Yet the industry disregards this and places pins where it can, effectively building on top of fiction created from fiction. And speaking of fiction, let's see what Count Dracula says about himself in Stoker's novel. Not what movie tells us, not what later adaptations added, but what the Count actually claims in those long speeches to Jonathan Harker. Because, as hinted before, when you map out his autobiography, this story does not adapt to Vlad III. According to the Count himself, his bloodline goes back to the Attila the Hun. He tells Harker, "We Shekels have right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights." The Shekels were a Hungarian-speaking people in Transylvania who claimed descent from Attila's Huns. But Vlad III didn't belong to them. He was Wallachia nobility, a completely different ethnicity, a different language, and a different origin story. The Count continues claiming his people bore the Huns' sweep westward, and that the blood of those Ugric tribes flows in his veins. He speaks to my dismay, as I had to reread this to check if I didn't miss something, of Thor and Vodin, Norse gods that have nothing to do with Romanian history. He's describing a Magyar Viking Hun hybrid that exists nowhere in actual history. It's like claiming to be descended from both Napoleon and Genghis Khan through a lineage of Aztec warriors. Then there is a Count's military history. He says he fought the Turks on the bloody field of Mohacs. The Battle of Mohacs happened in 1526, 50 years after Vlad's death. He mentions fighting when the Wallachian and the Magyar War, which could refer to several distinct conflicts spanning centuries. He claims to have been part of every significant military event in the region's history, as if he personally experienced 500 years of warfare. The physical description doesn't match either. Jonathan Harker describes the Count as tall, thin, with a white mustache, dressed in black, with hair growing in his palms. Descriptions of Vlad III, admittedly not many survived, describe him as a short to medium height, clean-shaven, or with a black mustache in his younger years, and no one mentions palm hair. The German woodcuts show someone who looks nothing like Stoker's Count. And that's the myth. The Count's relationship with his castle. He speaks of it as an ancestral home, where his family has lived for centuries. But Vlad III's actual castle, whether you meant Ponerai or argue for another location, wasn't an ancient family seat. Ponerai was rebuilt by Vlad using forced labor, as we discussed in chapter 5. It wasn't some ancestral Gothic pile, but a practical military fortification. Despite that, at least in my experience, Ponerai was always pointed to as this one undisputed place where Mr. Vlad committed unspoken atrocities. Quite interesting when you come to see this as a total spin-off of the Stoker story. The Count also claims he learned his dark arts at the schoolmen's. Stoker lifted this straight from Emily Gerard's essay on Transylvanian superstitions. According to Gerard, who was probably misunderstanding local folklore, the schoolmen's was a school where the devil taught 10 students dark magic, keeping the 10th as a payment. The Count implies he was the 10th student, but outsmarted the devil. Vlad III, whatever else he was Orthodox Christian and never associated with any occult learning in any historical source. Think about the sources Stoker was stitching together that we spoke about so far. From Wilkinson's book The Name and the Devilish Meaning, from Gerard's essay The Schoolmen's and Nosferatu, from general readings about Hungary, the Shekli and the Attila connections, from Ottoman histories, various battles and conflicts, from Wallachian history, a vague sense of fighting Turks, from vampire folklore, the rules and limitations of the undead, from his own imagination, the specific powers, the aristocratic bearing, the ancient but eloquent English. Each thread came from somewhere different, and Stoker wove them into something that had never existed before. A vampire who has simultaneously an ancient warrior, a learned occultist, Eastern European nobility, an incarnate evil. The Count claims to be the last of my race, but his race is entirely fictional, a composite that borrows authority from multiple real sources, but is not bound to any of them. This composite method extends to Count's supernatural abilities. Traditional Romanian folklore, vampires couldn't turn into animals. Stoker added that. They couldn't control the weather. Stoker added that too. They weren't repelled by crucifixes particularly. That came from Stoker mixing vampire lore with a broader demon lore. Each power came from different tradition, creating a vampire more powerful and versatile than any single folklore tradition described. The Count's relationship with blood is also unique to Stoker. In folklore, vampires drank blood, yes, but Stoker added the quasi-scientific element of blood as a literal life force that could be transferred, shared, and corrupted. The Count doesn't just drink blood, he creates blood bonds, shared blood memories, and uses blood as a medium of control. This blood mysticism owes more to Victorian occultism and nested theories about heredity than to any folklore tradition. The genius of this teaching is that it creates a monster who feels authentic, without being historically accurate. Every element has a source, a precedent, a tradition behind it. But the combination is entirely original. It's like Stoker created a documentary about a fictional country using only real footage from other places. Come to think of it, but this is a hot take, I think it could be classified as an ARG. And this is why every attempt to solve Dracula by pinning him in actual history fails. He's not a historical figure with added vampirism. We are those who added a vampire cloak to a historical figure. Stoker's vampire is a fictional creation borrowing authority from real events while being bound by none of them. And once again, Stoker's research effort really drives home this point. He had all the facts and stories literally on the table, but he handpicked them to create something unique and, well, immortal. One last thread of Stoker's work I'd like to pull is picking Transylvania as Dracula's home. When Count Dracula tells Jonathan Harker, "We are in Transylvania," and Transylvania is not England. He's stating something that seems obvious, but actually contains the entire anxiety of Stoker's novel. The Count isn't just from a different place, he's from a different category of place. A zone that Victorian imagination had constructed as the opposite of everything modern Britain came to be. I know this sounds a bit pretentious at this point, but bear with me here. This phenomenon has its name. Maria Todorova, writing about what she calls Balkanism, argues that Western Europe created the Balkans as the concept to define what it itself wasn't. If the West were rational, the Balkans were passionate. If the West was progressive, the Balkans were stuck in history. If the West was civilized, the Balkans were something else. Not quite far enough to be exotic, not quite European enough to be familiar, but cut in between, a perfect space for projecting anxieties. And Stoker's Transylvania fits this pattern perfectly. It's technically in Europe, but it doesn't feel European to Harker, and subsequently to the reader. People cross themselves and give him crucifixes. Too much religion, the wrong kind of religion. They know about evil in ways that make them both wise and primitive. The food is strange, paprika handy. Harker notes alien cuisine multiple times. When I read Stoker's book, I felt as if I were on the brink of an uncanny valley. It was very subtle, but it was there. I guess for a Victorian reader, the effect might have been even bigger. Or maybe it's other way around. As reading it today, you can experience it by reading English that it's not spoken anymore. You know, old school phrases and so on. Larry Wolff traced how Enlightenment thinkers essentially invented Eastern Europe as a category in the 18th century. And Voltaire, writing about Poland and Russia, created this image of lands where European civilization faded into Asiatic barbarism. By the Victorian era, this imaginary geography had hardened into an assumed fact. Transylvania wasn't just geographically east, it was culturally, religiously, morally east. A place where Western rules didn't quite apply. This brings us to what Stephen Arata identified as reverse colonization, the nightmare that the colonized might colonize back. By the 1890s, the British Empire was at its peak, but it was also increasingly anxious. If Britain could transform India, Egypt, and half of Africa, what prevented those places from transforming Britain? If goods and people could flow from the metropole to the colonies, couldn't threats flow in the opposite direction? Dracula embodies this reverse flow to the beat. He's not content to remain in Eastern Castle. He studies the English language and law. He buys property in London. He ships himself to the Empire's heart in a box of native earth, literally bringing his homeland with him. He didn't come as a simple invader, but as someone who mastered the colonizer's own tools: property law, shipping routes, currency exchange. The Count's boxes of earth are particularly brilliant as symbols. Colonial extraction brought foreign soil to London in the form of tea, spices and gold. Dracula brings actual soil, but this specific soil that allows him to reproduce his eastern existence in western space. He literally planting Transylvania in England, spreading his native ground like an infection through the imperial body. In hyperbole and in literal meaning. Let's not lose the blood trace. Dracula pollutes English bloodlines. Lucy, one of the women in the story, the perfect English rose, became voluptuous and cruel after his infection, being excessive in ways Victorians associated with foreign women. When she's vampirized, she goes after children, threatening the literal future and the innocent part of the English race. The Count boasts to the heroes that he's creating a new order. Your girls that you love are mine already, and through them you and others shall yet be mine. Dracula is having an absolute alpha moment here. Mina's infection is even more symbolic. Dracula forces her to drink his own blood while declaring she is now flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood. A perversion of marriage vows and love sanctity. He's not just attacking her, but claiming her, making her partially Eastern, partially other. The 1890s context matters here enormously. This is the decade of Oscar Wilde's trials, of debates about degeneration, of panic about declining British birth rates while colonial populations exploded. Immigration from Eastern Europe, particularly Jewish immigration, was transforming London's East End. The Ottoman Empire still existed, controlling territories in Europe. Germany was rising as industrial power. The stable Victorian world order was visibly wobbling. Dracula channels all these anxieties into a single figure. Ancient but adapting, foreign but speaking perfect English, isolated but infectious. He represents everything the empire feared about its own success. That openness to trade meant openness to invasion, that the flows of empire might reverse. All those aspects reveal the true horror of the Dracula story. It's more than just about spooky scary skeletons and vampires from the middle of nowhere. Dracula is the reflection of our fears. And I mean our because that anxiety hasn't gone away. Every generation has its own fears similar to those of the Victorian era. Communist infiltration, terrorist infiltration, viral infiltration. While this aspect of the story hasn't been particularly visible due to the passage of time, it's still there. And in my eyes, it states the quality of Stoker's artisanal work. But you reckon that the quality of Dracula's story stands on its own, as it is still kicking, even if it's afterlife. It inspired the whole gamut of events, initiatives, and the industry. In 2022, 1,369 people dressed as vampires gathered on a Whitby's Abbey steps, setting a new Guinness World Record. They'd beaten the previous record set in Virginia by exactly one vampire. Only discussing the highest achievers here. Whitby also attracts about 50,000 visitors during its twice-yearly Goth Weekends, which began in 1994 as a small music festival and have evolved into something between a cultural celebration and an economic necessity. Hotels that might struggle to fill rooms in late October charge premium rates. The Bram Stoker International Film Festival brings additional visitors. The Dracula Experience, a walk-through attraction with animatronics and theatrical blood, runs year-round on Marine Parade. The whole thing is actually quite impressive for a town that's built a significant chunk of its economy on 3 chapters from a novel written by someone who visited once. Dracula arrives there, Lucy gets attacked there, but most of the action happens in London and Transylvania. Yet Whitby has claimed Dracula more successfully than anywhere else, partially because it's the only place in the novel you can actually visit and find it largely unchanged. Those 199 steps are the same ones Stoker climbed. The churchyard where Lucy sleepwalks still has the same view. The harbor where the Demeter crashed looks essentially identical. So, if you want to trace Dracula's steps, this is as definitive as it gets. Because in Romania, the situation is complicated. Bran Castle, marketed as Dracula's Castle, receives about 800,000 visitors annually. It's a stunning medieval fortress perched dramatically on a cliff, about 30 kilometers from Brasso. There's just one problem. Vlad III probably never lived there. He might have attacked it once, he possibly spent a few nights there as a prisoner, but calling it Dracula's Castle is like calling a hotel Napoleon's place because he might have stopped there once during a campaign. The castle's actual history as a royal residence for Queen Mary of Romania in the 1920s is genuinely interesting, but try selling tickets to Queen Maria's castle versus Dracula's castle. The association started in the 1970s when communist Romania, desperate for Western currency, began marketing Dracula tours. They picked the brand because it looked the part, imposing, gothic, accessible to tourists. Truth was negotiable. Hard currency wasn't. Ponerai Castle, Vlad's actual fortress, sits in ruins on a remote mountaintop accessible only by climbing 1,480 concrete steps. Maybe 30,000 visitors make the trek annually. It's historically authentic but commercially challenged. The ruins, while genuinely connected to Vlad III, don't look like what people expect from Dracula's castle. They expect bronze Gothic towers, not Ponerai's practical military ruins. This creates a bizarre situation where the fake Dracula castle prospers while the real one crumbles. Romania announced restoration plans for Ponerai, but while those efforts are commendable, in practice, it's easier to sell overpriced wine and themed sleepovers in places that claim a connection to Vlad, while it's diluted to the point of homeopathy. And so the Romanian relationship with Dracula tourism remains conflicted. On one hand, it brings millions in revenue. Hinted Dracula tours, Dracula hotels, Dracula restaurants. The infrastructure employs thousands. The town of Sighișoara, Vlad's birthplace, has turned his supposed birthhouse into a restaurant where you can eat vampire steak in a room where the actual impaler might have been born. On the other hand, many Romanians resent having their country reduced to a vampire story written by an Irishman who never visited. On top of that, Vlad III is considered a national hero by many. A defender against the Ottoman invasion, a strong leader in chaotic times. Think mainstream connection with Abraham Lincoln being a vampire hunter first and foremost. As its people, the Romanian government is also conflicted. Post-communist governments initially embraced it as easy marketing, then pulled back amid cultural criticism. In 2001, plans for Dracula-themed park near Sighișoara were cancelled following protests from historians and environmentalists. The current stance is closest to resigned acceptance. If tourists want vampires, give them vampires, but try to sneak in some actual history and culture. And so we get Bran Castle with a Dracula sticker. Among other attractions are mentioned Dracula's birthplace, Dracula's castle, and Dracula's wine from vineyards that claim the connection to Vlad's lands. Since he ruled the whole region, that's quite a claim. One person who took an interest in this phenomena is Duncan Light. He spent years studying Romanian tourism and documented what he calls Dracula dilemma. The country simultaneously depends on and deplores its vampire association. His research found that many Western tourists are genuinely surprised to learn Dracula isn't the main thing Romanians think about. They arrive expecting a nation of vampire enthusiasts and find a modern EU country that would rather talk about its tech sector. This is the first time I ever thought about the Romanian tech sector, so they may have a point here. But the money is undeniable. Dracula tourism contributes an estimated 200 million euros to Romania's economy annually. Whitby's Goth weekends generate about 1.5 million pounds for the local economy per event. These aren't trivial sums for regions that might otherwise not have much else to offer, at least from an economic standpoint. The vampire literally puts food on tables, even as it reduces complex histories to Halloween decorations. Some Romanian tours decided to build on top of this kitsch. They offer Beyond Dracula experiences, using the vampire hook to draw tourists, then educating them about actual Romanian history and culture. Even Whitby's Goth Weekend has evolved beyond pure vampirism into a celebration of afterlife culture generally. Although I'm not convinced that it started from celebrating Dracula, to be honest, judging by this photo at least. There's something fascinating about how Dracula tourism works. A fictional character based on misunderstood history, written by someone who never visited the places described, has created an entire economy around fake authenticity. Tourists visit fake castles to see real places connected to imaginary events based on distorted facts. And on top of that, one bloody ruler from the pages of history got mixed up in all this by providing a name that got its roots in a Christian knightly order. That last part is particularly ironic, given that we are talking about a vampire after all. Say the name Dracula to someone, anyone, and watch what happens. Maybe a smile, maybe a subtle tension. They know exactly what you mean, even though what you mean could be a medieval prince, a Victorian novel, 100 different movies, or just a vague sense of elegant menace. This is what philosophers of language call a performative utterance, and I learned about it just now. A word that doesn't just describe, but actually does something in the word. When you say Dracula, you're not just referencing a character. You're activating the entire psychological and cultural apparatus that's been developing over the past 6 centuries. Think about how the name functions linguistically. We say, "He's real Dracula," and everyone understands this means predatory, parasitic, but with style. It's become a category, a type, a diagnosis, but it's also still a specific individual. The Count, the historical Vlad, the Stoker character. The name Dracula began to take on a life on its own at this point. In the 1950s, Dracula films were about communist infiltration, the enemy who looks like us but serves foreign power. In the 1980s, they became concerned about disease and contaminated blood during the AIDS crisis. In the 2000s, vampires became romantic as we processed different anxieties about cultural revolution. The name Dracula served as a container for whatever dread each era needed to externalize. Freud's concept of the uncanny, described in Das Unheimliche, which served as a basis for the uncanny valley, helps explain why the name still unsettles us. Is this particular discomfort of something familiar becoming strange, or just different enough to unsettle us? Just as H.P. Lovecraft said, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. And when we go over all the themes listed a moment ago, all of them can be distilled to the uncertainty of what will happen next. What's also worth pointing out is how the name resists exhaustion. Most cultural symbols wear out through overuse, becoming clichés drained of power. But Dracula seems to resist this, finding a new reference with each generation. Perhaps because the anxieties it represents, death, predation, loss of self, are permanent features of human experience. The name stays fresh because the fears stay fresh. Projecting those fears to our current times, with concerns about artificial intelligence, social media manipulation and systemic exploitation, Dracula's feelings are relevant as ever. He's the algorithm that feeds on engagement, the influencer who drains his followers, the system that sustains itself through extraction. I don't think that it's just me when I say this. All those ideas listed before would be considered an interesting take on an old concept if it were put on a silver screen. So, we've traced the name from medieval Wallachia to local Halloween store. We've seen it mean dragon and devil, hero and monster, historical prince and fictional count. We've watched it transform from patronymic identifier to a global brand, from a political title to a sociological diagnosis. To recap this stream of consciousness, we looked at the name Dracula from 3 different angles. First, there's a historical angle. Vlad III, voivode of the Wallachia, fighting for survival in an impossible political situation. A real person who made real decisions in a real place, most of which had nothing to do with vampires and anything to do with the brutal logic of 15th century statecraft. This Dracula impaled people not because he was supernatural, but because in his life the stakes were high. I'm sorry. He was a human trying to hold power in a system designed to prevent anyone from holding the power. There's the literary angle. Count Dracula, Stoker's creation, who borrowed the historical name and some context but nothing else. An Irish theatre manager's fever dream of Eastern threat and Western anxiety, stitched together from travel books and folklore, owning more to Victorian London's fears than medieval Romania's realities. This Dracula never existed, but feels more real than the one who did. Third, there's a cultural angle. Dracula as a free-floating signifier, meaning whatever we need it to mean. Corporate vampire, emotional parasite, stylish predator, misunderstood outsider. The Dracula belongs to no one and everyone, somehow always relevant to whatever we're worried about this decade. I think the strength of this legend comes from the fact that all three aspects are equally true. You can't fact-check culture out of existence. You can't culturally interpret historical events away. You can't art your way past either facts or meanings. The nerdy analogy that comes to mind is emulsion. An emulsion is a mixture of liquids that are normally separate, but due to performing sciences on them, they somehow form a stable mix. And this is exactly how I view Dracula. If you look closely, you can see separate parts and connections, but for a normie, it's just one thing. But even after you sort myth from story, the story isn't diminished. If anything, understanding how Dracula accumulated meaning makes it more impressive. In a world where most words and definitions are dumbed down to hide the ugly truth, such as measuring radiation in sunshine units, a topic George Carlin delivered perfectly in his take on soft language. Finding a word that does the opposite, it's refreshing. When I was reading about Dracula and adjacent stories and theories, I'm probably saying this for the fifth time, but what Stoker did is a masterpiece. Especially in his time. It's hard for me to judge how much of Dracula's success is due to his deliberate planning and how much to pure luck despite the research effort he put in. But when I think about all the places I saw Dracula recently, which are Alucard from Helsing and plethora of vampires from Castlevania, or Renfried. Side note, the Renfried is actual character from the novel. It really gets my brain going to think if there were some nuances I missed. I certainly would keep my eyes open for those when I finally come around to watch Castlevania Nocturne. On the side note, not only Vlad is based on real fiction. There is also mentioned somewhere in the middle Carmilla and others. I really hope you enjoyed listening to this rambling and you learned something interesting by chance. Do you know about all the aspects that went into creating Dracula's myth? Hell, did you even know about Stoker's novel? Tell me what you think in the comments. And also, what you think about delivery and the overall format, as this expose is a new thing for me. I again remind you that the next upload will be me retelling the original story of Dracula. So if you want to get all the references I made throughout this video, subscribe to stay in touch. Sincerely, thank you for watching. Cześć!